A lot of birds and mammals are pretty territorial. Even sometimes fish can be. Not something we exactly identify with. Well, maybe we identify with it a little more than you might think. Usually, unlike us, that kind of protect our territory for maybe legal reasons or social reasons, birds and mammals, usually it comes down to food and reproduction. Those are the two main reasons they would go through the trouble of establishing and defending a territory. And this is hard work. This is extra. You gotta do life. You gotta eat and you gotta sleep and you gotta find shelter and you gotta find a mate. And then this is extra. This is on top of that. You know, it'd be easier. Looks like I'm about ready to rebuild this fence this summer. It'd be easier not to do that. You know, just let it go. And but there are reasons that it's worth the effort. And same with animals. There's a cost and there's a benefit, and usually they try to find a good balance between the two. So if you wanted to maintain your territory, then you could do it in a few ways. You could patrol constantly, but that's probably not realistic. So chemical marks, probably another option to combine with that. You can do it just audibly and make sounds or sing songs. That'd be a strange thing for us to do, to just sing songs and maintain our territory, but birds do this frequently. Agonistic displays are kind of the precursor to an actual fight, which most species would really like to avoid at all costs. The opposite of territoriality is kind of a communal lifestyle, and bats will do this frequently. They live together and kind of depend on one another, huddling together for warmth and living in close quarters. So not all species really choose to maintain and defend a territory. So besides that, let's just get on to territoriality. Well, cougars, very territorial species. The females and males. Females, it's more about the food resources, right? They're gonna set it up somewhere where they reasonably have a number of deer and elk to eat, and so they'll set up a territory to feed them and their young, and then another female may have a territory next to them, and maybe another one around there, and another one over here. So they kind of pretty much stay separate. They'll put scat marks and others, urine marks all around the edge of their territory, so that if this group kind of wanders too far, they can sense that and sort of turn around and come back. And that prevents fighting altogether. You know, if this female were to wander into this territory, well, real good chance we'd have a fight on our hands. Now, the male territory might overlap several female territories, quite a bit larger. His is somewhat about food, but obviously largely about mates in the next male territory over in here. And so males have bigger territories, partly for mating and partly for the other resources, like the food in there as well. And they mark them and defend them in the same way, largely through scent. A lot of that communication is purely chemical, something that we're not really aware of, and other species are. Wolves would be about the same way. They live in packs, and so they kind of break down territorial boundaries for themselves. But if you're part of a pack, then you maintain a big territory, mostly for food. So not so much for reproduction. That's the purpose of the pack structure, but certainly for the food within that territory. Bighorn sheep, a little bit different here. This might be stretching it a little bit. Plenty of food for them, so that's not really that big of a deal. They just eat grasses, and they will then defend a harem during the rut, during mating season, and the male will defend that territory, and it is a geographically specific place with many ewes, the female bighorn sheep, in one place. And now the ultimate is a fight like this where they butt heads, and I'm sure you could find plenty of videos about this, as well as deer and elk clashing. Bighorn sheep are just particularly impressive, and they have their own way of adapting and making sure they don't get brain damage when they butt their horns. But more likely, a male is going to approach the top male and look at him and say, there is no way I'm going to take him on, and just leave. Now, if they're about equal, they might start posturing, sizing each other up a little bit. And if they find that one is weaker than the other, it may just leave. But if they're about equal, then they might actually get into a fight over the females. So even our friendly neighborly robin that you'll see around your yard is making a territory to defend, to make sure that it has food, but also probably because it has a nest there and a mate. And they need enough food to be able to feed the young. So it's a lot about reproduction in their case. For red-winged blackbirds, little of both, but there's usually such abundant resources that it's probably mostly about having a mate. So the male red-winged blackbird, you should listen to their calls on the All About Birds site. And it wouldn't be hard to go to a wetland and hear it for yourself, even better. But they're calling and calling and calling all day long. They just never seem to stop. And that's saying, this is my territory. This is my little patch. Everybody else stay out. And the females that like this patch, come on in. I'm happy to let you nest here and let me sire your young, and then we'll all be good. And so that's the red-winged blackbird, mostly for mating purposes. Woodpeckers, we met this one before, the pileated woodpecker, and many others as well like it. They will dig holes in trees. Now that's no small effort, and not every tree can do. It has to be a certain size and hardness of the wood, etc. And they burrow out a large nest cavity, and the male does that, and he does all that work to prepare for a female that comes along and say, look, I have this nest. You need a nest. I would like to produce offspring. Would you work out a deal with me here? And then they'll pair up, and he can advertise this by drumming, just knocking on the wood and saying, hey, I have this nice hollow tree here. And the females know that signal. They're well attuned to it and know that a male is advertising to them, and they might decide to go and check it out. Now, I'm sure at some point you've seen a display like this, a dog running straight at you, looking ferocious, baring his teeth and barking loudly. And hopefully nothing came of that, but chances are it was really just for display. So this is likely to happen if one animal wanders into another one's territory. It didn't heed all the warning marks, the signs that were left, the nice chemicals left in urine and scat, maybe some scratch marks, songs or other sounds. Just none of those things were heeded, and the animal, for whatever reason, came in. Well, neither of them really want to fight. And so likely they're going to try this one first and kind of size the other one up, or at least try to scare him off. And it may lead to a fight, but chances are the weaker one will back down. We're going to try to avoid that fighting at all costs. Now, animals have a different sort of display than we do, and we have similar ones. If you've ever seen usually two middle school boys, maybe high school boys, get aggressive, maybe over
a girl or something else, some sort of offense, they'll kind of puff their arms out to the side and stand up a little bit taller and sort of, bump chests or something like that. Well, neither of them necessarily, most likely, wants to fight. It's a display, and hopefully one will back down, but they don't always. Now, for us, smiling is a sign of friendliness, and that is not true for most animals, any animals really. If you show your teeth, you're saying, I'm going to bite you. And so, um, it's really not the same. We think of it that way, but us smiling does not mean to an animal that we're being friendly. It means we want to bite them. And so that we might get a similar response, but we shouldn't interpret them showing their teeth the other way, and usually that's not the case. Now, this may be a bit of a stretch to call this territorial behavior, but I'd like to make a nod to the plants anyway and say they're in direct competition as well, and they can't grow on top of one another, so they need some way of signaling one another as well. And so there are quite a few species that put out chemicals that discourage other plants from growing. Uh, if you have an oak in your yard, you probably have trouble growing many other things underneath it. In fact, if you pull out a garden book, they'll have specially adapted plants that will grow under oaks. And we know that this is called an allelopathic chemical, a chemical that the plant puts out to discourage other plants from germinating underneath it. Essentially saying, this is my patch of dirt, keep out. It's my water, it's my nitrogen, it's my phosphorus. And it doesn't work all the time, but many times it does. And oaks are pretty bad about this. They put out a lot of tannins, and that discourages other species from growing. Western red cedars and a lot of other conifers will drop these needles. They heavily shade what's underneath them, causing them to have trouble growing as well. So you build up this thick layer of, sometimes people call it duff, just all the dead material along with those chemicals, prevents other things from growing underneath them. So, and I just want to mention and kind of close with this interesting aside. There's this interesting plant called pine drops, and this is kind of sunny, which is a little deceptive, but this one grows in that deep shade of those conifer forest. And it's basically given up and said, yep, you got me. There's no light to be had underneath here. And so it's an unusual plant in that it is saprophytic. It's not photosynthetic. You can tell here it's not green. It actually thrives by getting nutrients from the fungi that break down all that dead leaf material underneath the ground. So it looks like this one is growing. This is actually its flowering stage, and then a little bit later on, it just looks like this dried stalk. It's kind of an interesting plant and a way of getting around some of those sort of quasi-territorial behavior of other plants.